In the summer of 1806, one of the longest-standing political entities in European history was extinguished, the Holy Roman Empire. This empire had existed since the coronation of Otto I in the year 962 AD, serving as a loose framework that united hundreds of scattered principalities, cities, and duchies in the heart of Europe. Yet this entity, long a subject of debate between those who saw it as a shield for Christian unity and those who dismissed it as a mere legal illusion, came to an official end on August 2nd at the hands of its last emperor, Francis II. So, what led to the collapse of this ancient entity? What circumstances pushed Francis II to abandon the crown? And how was this momentous event received in a Europe already ablaze with revolutions and Napoleonic wars? If you're a lover of history and the magic of great events, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you never miss an update. From the moment Otto I was crowned emperor by Pope John the Mournoith in 962 AD, the nucleus of the Holy Roman Empire was formed as an attempt to revive the glory of the Western Roman Empire, which had collapsed centuries earlier. However, this imperial newborn was never a unified or centralized state in the political sense. Rather, it resembled a sprawling network of kingdoms, principalities, duchies, and bishoprics, loosely tied together by a religious and political bond under the emperor's banner. Over time, instead of this network solidifying into a strong state, fragmentation deepened, and the gap between the center and its peripheries widened. The emperor bore a grand title, yet he often lacked direct authority over most of the lands in his empire. This structural weakness was no coincidence. It was the product of centuries of feudal traditions, geographic obstacles, and conflicting interests among local princes. Each regional ruler within the empire held a significant degree of political and military autonomy and was often seen as a king within his own small realm. Although the emperor was elected by the 7 electors, these elections were frequently subject to political extortion and the complex power balances among major dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, and the Luxembourgs. Since the Middle Ages, the rift between the imperial crown and its constituent states had been widening. Powerful entities began asserting their influence at the expense of imperial authority, most notably Austria, Bavaria, Bohemia, and later Prussia. As for the free imperial cities, they grew economically and socially, but saw the emperor as a distant symbol with little actual interference in their affairs. The crisis at the center worsened with the serious religious and political developments of the 16th and 17th centuries. With the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation, the empire split religiously between Catholics and Protestants, and religion became a force of division rather than unity. The 30 Years' War, at its core, both a religious and political conflict within the empire, devastated vast swaths of its territory and laid bare its fragile structure. When that war ended with the Peace of Westphalia, the empire was no longer what it once had been. The treaty granted the princes sovereign powers over foreign policy, military, and taxation, meaning their authority now exceeded that of the emperor himself. By then, the emperor had become more of an honorary figurehead, presiding over a body with no real leadership, no unified army, no shared taxes, not even a common foreign policy. The empire was no longer the central power shaping the fate of Central Europe, but rather a negotiating platform among the real players: Austria, Prussia, France, and England. Even within the German lands, imperial identity meant little anymore. Regional and national identities had begun to take its place. In this context, the Holy Roman Empire was slowly decaying from within. It didn't collapse in a single blow, but eroded over centuries. It didn't fall to a decisive external war, but withered gradually under the weight of its own contradictions and its inability to adapt to the modern age. So when the winds of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars swept through Europe, they encountered no solid structure to resist, only a fragile edifice awaiting its official fall. By the end of the 18th century, Europe stood on the brink of an unprecedented transformation, unlike the political changes the continent had experienced for centuries. The French Revolution, which broke out in 1789, was like an explosion at the heart of the old European order, a system long based on the legitimacy of kings, the church, and the nobility. The revolution turned it upside down. It wasn't merely an internal struggle between monarchy and people. It was the birth of a new world grounded in ideas unfamiliar to the continent: citizenship, republicanism, equality before the law, and the right of peoples to self-determination. European peoples embraced these ideas with enthusiasm, but they terrified the ruling elites, especially in countries like Austria, which saw the revolution as an existential threat to hereditary rule. In response to this revolutionary tide, Europe's major powers tried to contain it and overthrow the nascent French Republic. Thus began a series of revolutionary wars that swept through the continent, with the Holy Roman Empire drawn into a conflict it was wholly unprepared to face. Despite Austria's efforts, as the empire's strongest component, to resist the revolutionary wave, internal fragmentation undermined its ability to wage a prolonged war. The German states were not eager to fight in defense of an empire that no longer held any real presence in their daily lives. Many of them viewed the new reality with a mixture of caution and opportunism. Amid this chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to prominence, a young general who had made his name in military campaigns in Italy and Egypt, before seizing power in the coup of November 18, 1799. Once in control of France, he opened a new chapter in the confrontation with the traditional European order. Napoleon was more than just a military commander. He was a political architect who understood that redrawing the map of Europe required dismantling the outdated structures that obstructed national unity and centralized power. Chief among them, of course, the Holy Roman Empire. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in a symbolic act that defied papal authority and declared himself the master of the new order. He didn't stop there. He immediately began dismantling the old framework of Central Europe. He launched successive campaigns against Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and won pivotal battles like Austerlitz in 1805, which humiliated the Austro-Russian alliance and revealed the military fragility of the Holy Roman Empire. Following these victories, Napoleon imposed his will on the German states, pushing them to withdraw from the imperial structure and join his new political project, the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, initially gathering 16 German states, with more joining later. This confederation was effectively a French satellite, ruled by local princes under French protection. With this move, Napoleon struck at the heart of the empire, depriving it of its most vital territories and effectively declaring its end as a functioning entity. The emperor's authority no longer extended to these regions, and no one in Europe still treated the Holy Roman Empire as a living force. This rapid erosion was both humiliating and painful for Francis II, Emperor of Austria and bearer of the Holy Roman Imperial title. The man who was supposed to be the guardian of Christian unity in Central Europe could no longer even protect the states that bore his name. The empire did not fall with one decisive blow, but through a series of shifts that made its continued existence impossible in a world being reshaped by Napoleon's force and cunning. Thus it became clear that the moment of reckoning was near, and the emperor had no choice but to bow before the storm. In the summer of 1806, Emperor Francis II found himself cornered by the forces of history. He was the heir to a majestic crown, carrying echoes of ancient Rome and the legacy of the Carolingian Empire. Yet in reality, he had become an emperor without an empire. He had witnessed firsthand how the German states fell apart one after another, most of them aligning with Napoleon, not merely by conquest, but out of fatigue with an entity that had become more of a symbolic burden than a protective shield. Francis was no stranger to the corridors of politics. As a scion of the venerable Habsburg dynasty, he knew that crowns were not preserved by wishful thinking, but by foresight and adaptability. Perhaps this awareness is what drove him to take a preemptive decision before the crown was forcibly stripped from his head. In 1704, 2 years before the dissolution of the empire, Francis made an extraordinary move by declaring himself Emperor of Austria under the title Francis I. This was not a mere change of formality, but a reflection of a deep transformation in Habsburg statecraft. Francis understood that the Holy Roman Empire was effectively dead and that the future of his rule and dynasty depended on building a new, more realistic legitimacy rooted in his actual control over Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. He recognized that the world had changed and that the peoples of Europe no longer saw ancient titles as substitutes for modern armies and centralized governance. On August 2, 1806, Francis took the decisive step. He formally abdicated the title of Holy Roman Emperor and informed the European powers that the empire, long a stage for rituals, treaties, and alliances, had come to an end. This declaration was not the result of a humiliating treaty, as would happen in future wars, but a unilateral decision made out of conviction that clinging to the title was merely chasing a mirage. Though the abdication passed with relative quiet, its echoes were profound. It closed the book on centuries of imperial history and signaled the final breath of the old order in the heart of Europe. Francis was not betraying a legacy, but responding realistically to necessity. He chose to salvage what remained of his dynasty's influence rather than burn its last assets in a losing battle against Napoleon. In doing so, he became a model of a ruler who gave up symbolic glory in favor of political survival. At that moment, there was no grand funeral procession for the Holy Roman Empire, no formal obituary worthy of its long heritage. Only a legal and official silence that marked the end of the longest-lasting empire in post-Roman Europe. When the chapter of the Holy Roman Empire was closed, Europe was no longer what it had been. The continent had entered a new era, no longer based on inherited structures and religious symbolism, but on the rise of nation-states, the entrenchment of national sovereignty, and the emergence of the people as political actors. The fall of the empire was not merely a political void in Germany or a lost title in Vienna, but a shift in how power, governance, and belonging were understood at the core of the continent. With its end, Europe lost the last living embodiment of the idea of a Christian empire, an idea that, since the Middle Ages, had sought to unite the Western world under one banner in the name of faith and Roman legitimacy. Yet as much as the empire ended politically, it remained alive in historical memory and in the conflicts of the peoples who had grown up within its former framework. In the German lands, the longing for unity endured, not out of loyalty to a long-gone emperor, but due to the sense of weakness left behind by the absence of a unifying entity. The small, fragmented states felt vulnerable amid the great powers surrounding them. France to the west, Russia to the east, and Austria and Prussia from within. Although Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine brought a degree of temporary order, a growing sense emerged that Germany needed a real, unified sovereign state. Thus, the end of the empire planted the seeds of the German national project, which would later mature under Prussian leadership and culminate in the unification of Germany in 1871. But this unity was not a resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. It was its opposite, a centralized, militarized state founded on the idea of nationhood rather than religion, on the sword rather than the sacred crown. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs clung to their imperial legacy through the Austrian crown, which became a multi-ethnic entity encompassing Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slavs, and others. However, it faced bitter internal struggles among its ethnic components. For many years, Vienna remained the capital of an empire that tried to present itself as the heir to the Holy Roman Empire, albeit without its ecclesiastical or universal character. By the 20th century, even that effort had begun to wither, ultimately collapsing after World War I, bringing an end to the last dynasty that had ruled in the name of that ancient memory. In European consciousness, the Holy Roman Empire remained a unique example of an unprecedented form of governance. It blended Latin and Germanic traditions, church and state, the symbolism of Rome with the pragmatism of the medieval world. It was an ambiguous experiment, hard to categorize. Not a nation-state, not a colonial empire, not an absolute monarchy, but a hybrid entity that lived by balancing powers and fell when that balance broke. Perhaps for that very reason, it remains the subject of study and reflection among historians, not just as a political model, but as a mirror reflecting Europe's longest struggles between unity and diversity, center and periphery, idea and reality. Thus, the fall of the Holy Roman Empire was not merely an end, but the beginning of a new era, and of new questions about the nature of power, the meaning of belonging, and the role of history in shaping the present. It was the end of an empire, but not the end of the idea.